My name is Lydia, and I'm a 32-year-old architect. For most of my life, I believed that my job was to design buildings that would stand the test of time, structures built on solid, reliable foundations. I never imagined that the most important structure I would ever have to inspect, and ultimately condemn, was my own family. They had a name for my purpose in their lives, a purpose I only discovered when my brother was dying and they demanded I give up a piece of myself to save him. They called it my familial duty, but the truth was far more sinister. The truth was that I was their biological insurance plan, and the day I found out was the day their whole world came crashing down. Before I dive into how a single medical test unraveled a lifetime of lies and led to a family showdown that nobody saw coming, I'd love to know where all of you are watching from today. Let me know in the comments below. And if you've ever felt like the odd one out in your own family, go ahead and hit that like button so I know I'm not alone. For all the new viewers here, make sure you subscribe to join our community of storytellers who know that sometimes the family you choose is the only one that truly matters. The foundation of my family was built on a single, unshakable truth. My younger brother, Kevin, was a miracle. He was born premature, a tiny, fragile thing who wasn't expected to survive the night. But he did. He survived, and in the eyes of my parents, Eleanor and Robert, he was sanctified by that struggle. He could do no wrong. His survival wasn't just a medical fact. It was the core mythology of our household. It explained everything. It excused everything. It was the reason he was the sun and I was a distant, orbiting moon, useful only for reflecting his light. I was the responsible one, the quiet one, the one who never caused any trouble. I got good grades, went to a state school on a patchwork of scholarships and student loans, and meticulously built a career for myself from the ground up. I thought my diligence and success would one day earn me a fraction of the unconditional adoration they showered on Kevin. Never did. My achievements were met with polite, distracted nods. When I graduated from architecture school with honors, they attended the ceremony but left early because Kevin had a migraine, which was code for a hangover. When my firm won a prestigious design award for a community library I had poured my soul into, my mother's only comment over the phone was, "That's nice, dear. Now, have you spoken to your brother? He's having a very hard time with his new business idea." The business idea, like all the ones before it, was a spectacular failure. It was a boutique pet food company specializing in artisanal gluten-free kibble. My parents had sunk over $50,000 into it, a significant chunk of their retirement savings. It followed the spectacular failure of his line of hand-painted surfboards, and before that, his career as a club promoter, which mostly involved him promoting his own access to our parents' bank account. The most painful wound, the one that festered for years, was my college fund. I had discovered, quite by accident when I was 19, that the account my parents had told me was waiting for me was empty. When I confronted them, my father shuffled his feet and stared at the floor while my mother, Eleanor, explained it with chilling pragmatism. "Lydia, Kevin needed it. His rehabilitation clinic wasn't cheap. It was a matter of life and death. You're strong, you can figure it out." He had crashed his car again, and this time there was a DUI involved. My fund, the money my grandparents had left for my education, had paid for a high-end facility in Malibu where he could find himself. I had worked 2 jobs, eaten ramen noodles for dinner 4 nights a week, and taken on a mountain of debt to get my degree. Kevin got to find himself on a beach. I found myself in the student loan office. This was the pattern of our lives. Kevin was a series of emergencies and I was the backstop. I was the sensible, reliable, low-maintenance daughter. I didn't need support, I didn't need investment. I was just there. A fixed point in their chaotic, Kevin-centric universe. And for 32 years I had accepted it. I had swallowed my resentment, buried my hurt, and continued to show up for holidays and birthdays, bringing thoughtful gifts and a polite smile, still chasing a crumb of the affection they gave him so freely. I told myself it was just the way things were. I told myself that one day they would see me. I was a fool. The call that began the demolition of my life came on a Tuesday afternoon. I was in my office, reviewing blueprints for a new sustainable housing project. The light was streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows, and I felt a rare sense of peace. My phone buzzed, displaying Mother. I almost let it go to voicemail, anticipating a monologue about Kevin's latest manufactured crisis. But a strange instinct made me answer. "Lydia," she said, her voice devoid of any preamble. It had a brittle, urgent quality I hadn't heard before. "It's Kevin. His kidneys. They're failing." The words hung in the air, cold and heavy like steel beams. I felt a confusing mix of emotions. A flicker of alarm, quickly extinguished by years of learned cynicism, and a weary sense of resignation. Another Kevin emergency. "What happened?" I asked, my voice carefully neutral. "Years of living hard," the doctor said, she replied, a euphemism for his drinking and drug use. "The point is, he's in stage 5 renal failure. He needs a transplant. Immediately." I closed my eyes, picturing my brother. Not the sainted miracle child, but the 30-year-old man with the petulant mouth and the empty eyes, always looking for his next handout. "Okay," I said slowly, trying to process it. "So he's on the transplant list." There was a beat of silence on the other end, a silence so heavy with expectation that it made my stomach clench. "The list could take years, Lydia. He doesn't have years. The doctors said a living donor is his best chance. A family member." And there it was. The other shoe didn't just drop. It crashed through the floor. I could hear the unspoken words as clearly as if she had screamed them. "You. We mean you, we've both been tested," my mother continued, her voice gaining a steely resolve. "Neither of us is a match. It has to be you." It wasn't a request. It was a summons. Demand. I felt a cold wave wash over me, a chilling combination of disbelief and a terrifying, dawning sense of inevitability. I was an architect. I knew that a building's integrity depended on its core components, and I was being told that I was, and had always been, nothing more than a spare part for the main structure. I don't know what to say," I stammered, the blueprints in front of me blurring into meaningless lines. "There's nothing to say," she retorted, her tone sharp, impatient. "You're his sister. This is your familial duty. You get tested. Your match. You give him your kidney. It's simple. Simple." The word was a slap in the face. She had just condensed a major life-altering surgery, a permanent alteration of my own body, into a simple, non-negotiable transaction. The casual entitlement in her voice, the complete disregard for my life, my health, my feelings, was breathtaking. It was as if she were asking me to pass the salt at the dinner table, not to have one of my vital organs removed. The years of resentment, the swallowed bitterness over the college fund, the missed birthdays, the constant, grinding unfairness, it all began to churn within me. "No," I said, the word tasting foreign and powerful on my tongue. "What did you say?" Her voice was laced with ice. "I said no," I repeated, a little stronger this time, a flicker of rebellion igniting in my chest. "I'm not doing it." The silence that followed was more damning than any argument. It was a void of pure, unadulterated shock. It was the sound of a queen realizing a pawn had just refused to be sacrificed. "Lydia," she finally said, her voice low and dangerous, "do not be selfish. Your brother's life is at stake. After everything we have done for you." The hypocrisy was so potent it almost made me laugh. Done for me. They had raided my future to pay for his mistakes. They had emotionally neglected me in favor of propping up his fragile ego. They had done nothing for me that wasn't secondary to Kevin's needs. "What exactly have you done for me, Mom?" I asked, the question sharp and genuine. "What have you done that wasn't contingent on me staying quiet and out of the way? We gave you a home. We fed you, we clothed you," she sputtered, falling back on the bare minimum of parental responsibility as if it were a grand act of generosity. "You are being unbelievably cruel and ungrateful. This is what family does. We sacrifice for each other." "No," I said, a sudden stark clarity cutting through my confusion. "In this family I sacrifice. Everyone else just takes." I ended the call before she could respond, my hand trembling as I set the phone down. The sunlight in my office suddenly felt harsh and interrogating. I stared at the blueprints, at the neat lines and precise measurements that promised order and stability, and felt my own internal architecture begin to tremble. This was more than just a request for a kidney. It was a final demand for a pound of flesh I was no longer willing to give. But I was naive. I thought my no was the end of the conversation. In reality, it was just the beginning of the war. The pressure campaign started within hours. My father called next. Where my mother was a blade, my father was a blunt instrument. His approach was less about direct command and more about emotional bludgeoning. "Lydia, your mother is beside herself," he began. His voice thick with a sorrow that I knew was reserved exclusively for Kevin's plight. "How can you be so cold? He's your brother. Your little brother." "He's a 30-year-old man who has made his own choices, Dad," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "And I've made mine. This isn't about choices, it's about life and death," he pleaded. "Do you want his death on your conscience? Think about it, Lydia. He's our miracle. Don't you remember how we almost lost him?" I remembered. Oh, I remembered. I remembered the stories being told at every family gathering, a secular gospel of Kevin's hallowed survival. I remembered my own childhood illnesses, the time I had pneumonia at age 7, being treated as an inconvenience, while Kevin's scraped knee warranted a week of solemn coddling. The memories were a floodgate, and his words had just thrown it open. I remembered my 10th birthday. I had begged for a specific telescope, a proper one for looking at the stars. My parents had surprised me with it, and for a few precious hours I was ecstatic. Felt seen. That evening, Kevin threw a tantrum because his own gift, a video game, wasn't the one he wanted. He cried and screamed that my present was better. The next morning I came downstairs to find my father showing Kevin how to adjust the focus on my telescope. "We decided you're a bit young for something this complicated, sweetie," my mother had said, patting my head. "Kevin will take good care of it for you." I never saw the telescope again. It ended up broken in his closet within a month. I remembered my high school graduation. I was valedictorian. I had a speech to give, a moment that was supposed to be mine. My parents were in the audience, but their phones were buzzing constantly. Just as I was walking to the podium, I saw them get up and hurry out of the auditorium. I gave my speech to an empty space where they should have been. I found them later in the parking lot, arguing. Kevin, who was supposed to be there, had been arrested for trying to buy beer with a fake ID and had called them in a panic from the local police station. My academic triumph was a footnote to his minor, predictable delinquency. They missed my moment, the culmination of years of hard work, to bail him out of trouble he had courted. "You understand, don't you, Lydia?" my father had said later, not as a question but as a statement. He needed us. These memories, and 1,000 others like them, swirled in my mind as I listened to my father's manufactured grief over the phone. His death on my conscience. I finally asked, my voice dangerously quiet. "Where was your conscience when you emptied my college fund to pay for his rehab? Where was it when you gave him my birthday present? Where were you when I was giving my valedictorian speech?" He was silent. I could hear his breathing, shallow and panicked. He had no answer. He had never been forced to have one. My role was to understand, to forgive, to absorb the injustice and move on. "This is different," he finally mumbled. "This is real." "It was real to me too," I said and hung up. The next phase of their campaign was to mobilize the troops. My Aunt Carol called, her voice dripping with pious disappointment. "Lydia, I am just so shocked to hear you're abandoning your family in their time of need. It's not how you were raised." My Uncle Mark left a voicemail, gruff and to the point. "You're being a damn fool, girl. You do what needs to be done." The narrative was set. I was the cruel, unfeeling daughter, withholding a life-saving gift from my poor, dying brother. No one asked about my side. No one considered the decades of history that had led to my refusal. The weight of their collective judgment was immense. It pressed in on me from all sides, making me feel small and monstrously selfish. My resolve began to waver. Was I being cruel? Was a lifetime of emotional neglect truly equivalent to a man's life? The gaslighting was working. I started to doubt my own perception of reality. That was their true power. They could create a reality, a narrative, and enforce it with such unshakable conviction that you began to believe it yourself. Maybe I was the problem. Maybe I was selfish. The thought was a familiar poison, one I'd been sipping my whole life. In a moment of weakness, worn down by the constant calls and the crushing weight of familial expectation, I called my mother back. "Okay," I said, the word tasting like defeat. "I'll do it. I'll get the workup. I'll see if I'm even a match." I told myself it was a compromise, a way to show I wasn't the monster they were painting me as. I reasoned that the chances of being a perfect match were statistically low anyway. This would be a gesture. I would go through the motions, be declared incompatible, and then they would have to leave me alone. I would have fulfilled my duty by trying. "I knew you'd see sense," my mother said, her voice filled with triumphant relief, not gratitude. "I'll have the transplant coordinator's office call you to set everything up." The trap had been set, and I had just walked right into it. I had no idea that in trying to prove my place in the family, I was about to discover I never had one to begin with. The hospital environment felt sterile and unwelcoming, a stark contrast to the warm, organic materials I preferred in my architectural designs. Everything was hard surfaces, fluorescent lights, and the faint, antiseptic smell of cleaning products. I was at the regional transplant center for the first day of my compatibility workup. The transplant coordinator, a woman named Linda with a kind but professional demeanor, walked me through the process. It was daunting. There would be blood tests, tissue typing, a full physical, a battery of psychological evaluations, and extensive consultations. "This is to ensure you're not only a match for your brother, but that you are physically and psychologically prepared for the donation," she explained, handing me a thick folder of forms. As I filled out page after page of my medical history, I felt a growing sense of detachment, as if this were happening to someone else. I was just an observer, a body being processed through a system. The blood draws were the worst part. I've always hated needles. As the phlebotomist filled vial after vial with my blood, I stared at the ceiling and tried to think about anything else. I thought about the clean lines of a blueprint, the satisfying logic of a structural support system. But my mind kept drifting back to Kevin. I pictured him lying in a hospital bed, his body failing him. For a fleeting moment, I felt a pang of something that might have been pity, but it was quickly replaced by a cold, hard knot of resentment. He had squandered his health, his opportunities, his life, all while being propped up by our parents. And now I was here, being subjected to this invasive, uncomfortable process to bail him out of his ultimate predicament. The transaction felt deeply, fundamentally unfair. That evening I met my best friend Sarah for dinner. Sarah was a razor-sharp corporate lawyer, and the only person in my life who saw my family for what they were. She listened patiently as I recounted the phone calls, the pressure, and my reluctant decision to get tested. Her expression grew stormier with every word. "Lydia, this is insane," she said, putting her fork down with a clatter. "This is coercive. They're not asking you, they're bullying you. You know that, right?" "I know, but," faltered. "But what? You think if you do this, they'll finally appreciate you? You think they'll suddenly turn around and say, 'Gosh, Lydia, thank you for the kidney. We're so sorry we treated you like a second-class citizen for 3 decades.'" Her words were blunt, but they were true. That was the pathetic, hidden hope, wasn't it? That this grand gesture, this ultimate sacrifice, would finally balance the scales. "I don't know what I think," I admitted, feeling a familiar wave of shame. I want the calls to stop. I want them off my back. If I'm not a match, it's over. And if you are a match," she pressed, her lawyerly gaze pinning me down, "then you're in an even worse position. Then they'll have what they see as a moral and medical claim on your body. You need to think about what happens then, Lydia. What do you want? Not them. You. We sat in silence for a moment as I absorbed her question. It was so simple yet so revolutionary. No one in my family had ever asked me what I wanted. My desires were irrelevant, an afterthought. My purpose was to serve the needs of the family unit, which really meant serving the needs of Kevin. I want them to see me, I finally whispered, the confession hanging in the air between us. I want them to see that I'm worth something too. Sarah reached across the table and squeezed my hand. You don't need them to see it, you just need to see it yourself. And for the record, your worth is not measured in spare organs. Her words stayed with me over the next week as I completed the rest of the workup. The psychological evaluation was particularly surreal. A kind-faced therapist asked me a series of questions about my motivations for donating. Are you feeling any pressure from your family? He asked gently. I felt a hysterical laugh bubble up inside me. Pressure, that was like asking if the ocean was damp. But I gave the correct answers. I talked about wanting to help my brother, about family obligation. I felt like an actor in a play, reciting lines I didn't believe. I was performing the role of the good sister, the dutiful daughter. All the while Sarah's question echoed in my head. What do you want? The call came 10 days later. It was Linda, the transplant coordinator. I was at my desk trying to lose myself in a complex elevation drawing, when my phone rang. My heart started hammering against my ribs. This was it. The moment of truth. She would tell me I wasn't a match, and this whole nightmare would be over. Lydia, hi, it's Linda from the transplant center, she said. Her voice was different this time. Not unkind but hesitant. There was a professional caution in her tone that immediately set me on edge. I'm calling about your test results. Okay, I said, my mouth suddenly dry. Am I a match? There was a pause. It stretched for an eternity. Well, that's a more complicated question than usual, she said slowly. We have your results back from the HLA typing and there's an anomaly. An anomaly. I repeated, my stomach tightening. What does that mean? Human leukocyte antigen typing is what we use to determine tissue compatibility, she explained, her voice taking on a clinical, textbook quality. It's based on genetic markers inherited from your parents. You get half from your mother, half from your father. The problem is, your HLA profile shows no commonality with the profiles we have on file for either Robert or Eleanor Sterling. I stared blankly at the wall, trying to make sense of her words. It sounded like technical jargon, a doctor's way of saying no. So, I'm not a match? I asked, a wave of relief washing over me. It's more definitive than that, Linda said, and her voice softened with what sounded like genuine sympathy. Ms. Sterling. Lydia. Based on the genetic markers we analyze, it's a statistical impossibility for you to be the biological child of Robert and Eleanor Sterling. The world stopped. The sounds of my office, the clicking of keyboards, the low hum of the air conditioning, the distant city traffic, all faded into a dull, roaring silence in my ears. The blueprint in front of me dissolved into a meaningless swirl of blue and white. A statistical impossibility. The phrase echoed in the sudden, cavernous emptiness of my mind. What are you saying? I whispered, my voice a thread. I'm saying, she said with deliberate, unmistakable clarity, that you were adopted. Adopted. The word didn't compute. It was a word for other people, for stories you saw on television. Couldn't possibly apply to me. My life, my history, my entire identity was built on the foundation of being a Sterling. A less loved Sterling, a background Sterling, but a Sterling nonetheless. I started to laugh, a strange, choked sound. No, I said. No, that's not possible. There's been a mistake. A mix-up at the lab. We reran the tests twice, Lydia, she said gently. The results are conclusive. You share no genetic material with the people you know as your parents. The floor fell out from under me. I gripped the edge of my desk, my knuckles turning white, as a lifetime of discordant memories, of feeling like an outsider in my own home, suddenly snapped into a horrific, crystal-clear focus. Why I looked nothing like them or Kevin. Why there were no baby pictures of me, only of him. Why my mother always spoke of my birth with a strange detachment, while Kevin's was a sacred epic. Why I had always felt like I was speaking a slightly different language, operating on a different emotional frequency. It wasn't my fault. It wasn't my personality. I was, and always had been, a stranger, an imposter in their house. A new thought, ugly and cold, began to form in the wreckage of my understanding. Why? Why would they adopt a child and never tell her? Why go to such lengths to maintain the lie? And then, the context of the current situation crashed down on me with the force of a physical blow. Kevin. The miracle child. Chronically ill from the start. They hadn't just adopted a child. They had acquired a contingency plan. They had gotten a baby not out of love, but out of a twisted, desperate form of pragmatism. They had chosen me to be a living, breathing bank of spare parts for their precious son. The familial duty they spoke of wasn't an emotional bond. It was a contractual obligation I never knew I had. A cold, hard fury, purer and more intense than any emotion I had ever felt, burned away my shock and grief. It was a fire that forged a new kind of strength inside me. They hadn't just lied to me. They had used me. My entire life had been predicated on a grotesque deception. I thanked Linda numbly and hung up the phone. For a long moment I just sat there, encased in the silence. Then I picked up my phone again. I didn't call my parents. I didn't call the people who had raised me under this monstrous pretense. Called Sarah. "It's done," I said, my voice eerily calm. "I got the results." "And?" she asked, her voice tense. "And I'm not a match," I said. "In fact, it's a statistical impossibility for me to be their daughter." There was a stunned silence on her end. "Lydia." "Oh my God. Are you okay?" "I'm better than okay," I said, and the calmness in my voice felt terrifying and exhilarating. "I'm free." And in that moment, I knew exactly what I had to do. The next call I made was not to my family. It was to a man whose number Sarah had given me months ago, just in case. His name was Marcus Thorne, a private investigator. "Mr. Thorne," I said, my voice ringing with a clarity I hadn't possessed an hour ago. "My name is Lydia Sterling. I need to find my birth family. And I need to do it now." The decision was a declaration of war. They wanted a piece of me to save their son. Instead, I was going to find the people I truly came from, and I was going to take my whole self back. The family meeting was staged for maximum psychological impact. My parents' living room, a space I had always found stuffy and overwrought, had been turned into an arena. On one side sat my parents, Eleanor and Robert, their faces set in grim, righteous lines. Kevin was between them, slumped in an armchair, playing the part of the tragic victim with practiced ease. He looked pale and drawn, but I could see the familiar glint of entitlement in his eyes. On the other side, arranged in a semicircle like a tribunal, were the reinforcements: my Aunt Carol, my Uncle Mark, and even their family pastor, Reverend Michael. It was an ambush, a carefully orchestrated intervention designed to break me down with the sheer weight of collective disapproval. I was supposed to walk in, see this united front of family and faith, and crumble. I walked in and felt nothing. The cold fury that had been simmering inside me for the past week had cooled into something far more dangerous. A crystalline, unbreakable calm. I was no longer a daughter seeking approval. I was an architect inspecting a condemned building, clipboard in hand, ready to sign the demolition order. "Lydia, thank you for coming," my father began, his voice taking on a somber paternal tone that made my skin crawl. "We're all here because we love you and we are deeply concerned." I met his gaze and gave a small, serene nod, waiting for them to play their hand. I had my own cards to play, and I knew they were holding a losing deck. "Your mother and I and your brother," he gestured to Kevin, who managed a weak, pathetic wave. "We've been so worried. Your refusal to help. It's not you, Lydia. It's selfish, and it's destructive." Aunt Carol chimed in, her voice oozing sanctimonious pity. "Your brother is dying, Lydia. Dying. How can you turn your back on him? On your own flesh and blood. Flesh and blood." The phrase hung in the air, a perfect, unintentional setup. I let the silence stretch, enjoying the discomfort that flickered across their faces at my lack of a response. They had expected tears, arguments, defensiveness. They weren't prepared for my composure. Reverend Michael cleared his throat, leaning forward with an air of gentle authority. "Lydia, the Bible teaches us about sacrifice, about laying down one's life for one's brother. In this case, the sacrifice is so much smaller, a gift of life that you can easily give. It is your Christian duty, your familial duty." They continued in this vein for several minutes, a chorus of accusation and moral posturing. They spoke of my duty, my obligation, the love I supposedly owed them. They painted a picture of me as a cold, heartless monster, and of Kevin as a blameless martyr. I listened to it all, every word a confirmation of the lie I had been living. My entire existence in their lives had been a preamble to this moment, the moment they would call in the debt. My mother, Eleanor, delivered what she clearly believed would be the final, crushing blow. "I am your mother, Lydia," she said, her voice trembling with what I'm sure she thought was righteous emotion. "I am begging you. Don't let your brother die because of some petty grudge. Do the right thing. Be the daughter I raised you to be." That was my cue. I let the silence settle again, a deep, profound quiet that absorbed all their noise. Then I stood up. I reached into my architect's portfolio, which I had placed beside my chair, and pulled out a slim file folder. "You're right," I said, my voice clear and steady, cutting through the thick atmosphere of the room. "You are all absolutely right. Family has a duty to one another. And a daughter should honor her parents." My mother's face relaxed into a smug, triumphant smile. She thought she had won. "But that's why I was so confused," I continued, opening the folder. "When I got these." I held up a single sheet of paper. It was the summary page from the hospital's genetic lab. I had highlighted a single sentence in bright yellow. "This is a report from the transplant center's genetics lab," I announced to the room. "It's quite technical, all about HLA markers and haplotypes. But there's one line here at the end that's very, very clear. Would you like me to read it?" No one spoke. The air was electric with confusion. I looked directly at Eleanor and Robert, whose smiles had vanished, replaced by masks of sudden, stark terror. They knew what was coming. "It says," I read, my voice ringing out in the silent room. "Conclusion. The subject, Lydia Sterling, shares no common HLA haplotypes with either Robert or Eleanor Sterling. Based on this data, it is a statistical impossibility that she is their biological offspring." A collective gasp went through the room. Aunt Carol's jaw dropped. Uncle Mark stared slack-jawed. Reverend Michael looked as if he'd been struck by lightning. But I only had eyes for my parents. My father, Robert, went white as a sheet, his face crumbling in on itself. My mother, Eleanor, however, held my gaze, her eyes blazing with a desperate, cornered fury. "It's a mistake," she hissed. "A lab error." "Is it?" I asked calmly, holding the paper out. "I had them run it twice. This is the truth, isn't it? The truth you've kept from me for 32 years. I am not your daughter." The room erupted into chaos. My aunt and uncle started firing questions, their voices overlapping in a panicked cacophony. "Robert, what is she talking about? Eleanor, is this true?" Under the barrage of questions, my father broke. He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. All eyes turned to Eleanor. She was a statue of ice, her composure cracking under the immense pressure. "We did it for him," she finally shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at Kevin. "He was so sick from the day he was born. The doctors said he might need a transplant one day. A kidney, bone marrow, anything. We had to be prepared." The ugly, monstrous truth was finally out, uglier than even I had imagined. She wasn't denying it. She was justifying it. "We couldn't have any more children after him," she continued, her voice rising hysterically. "Adoption was the only way. I chose you. We specifically looked for an infant from a healthy family, with a similar background. We chose you so you could be a match. So you could save him if you were ever needed. It was an act of love. An act of love. The words were so twisted, so profoundly selfish, that they sucked the air from the room. The pastor looked horrified. My aunt looked physically ill. They had chosen me like a piece of equipment. I wasn't a daughter. I was a biological insurance policy. I let her damning confession hang in the silence for a long moment. Then I delivered my verdict. So you see, I said, my voice devoid of all emotion, the familial duty you've all been lecturing me about doesn't apply. It was a contract I never signed, for a transaction I never agreed to. Therefore I will not be donating my kidney to Kevin. That is my final decision. I turned to Kevin, who was staring at me with a look of pure, uncomprehending horror. The miracle child was finally face to face with a problem that Mommy and Daddy couldn't fix for him. For the first time in his life, he was on his own. I then turned back to Eleanor and Robert. And since you are not my family, I said, delivering the final devastating blow, I see no reason to remain in your lives. I have hired a private investigator to find my real family. The one I will choose to be a part of. I closed my portfolio with a decisive snap. I walked out of that room, leaving behind the rubble of their lies and the stunned silence of the family that never was. The front door closed behind me with a solid, satisfying click, the sound of a prison gate swinging shut for the last time. I was free. The drive away from their house felt like surfacing for air after being held underwater for a very long time. I drove with the windows down, letting the cool night air whip through my hair, feeling it wash away the stale, suffocating atmosphere of that living room. I didn't cry. I didn't feel grief. I felt a profound, almost terrifying sense of lightness. The weight of their expectations, the crushing burden of their disapproval, the 32-year-long performance of being their daughter. It had all been lifted in one explosive, truth-filled moment. I drove straight to Sarah's apartment. She opened the door, took one look at my face, and pulled me into a fierce hug. "You did it," she whispered into my hair. "Oh my God, Lydia, you did it." We sat on her couch for hours, a bottle of expensive wine between us that she'd been saving for a special occasion. I recounted the entire scene, from the pastor's sermon on sacrifice to my mother's horrific confession. As I spoke, the emotional dam finally broke. Cried. I cried for the little girl who never understood why she wasn't loved the same way. I cried for the teenager who worked herself to the bone to earn an ounce of pride they never gave. I cried for the woman who had spent her entire adult life believing she was fundamentally flawed. It was a storm of grief, not for the family I had lost, but for the one I'd never had in the first place. Sarah just let me cry, holding my hand, refilling my glass, and offering the silent, unconditional support that I had craved my entire life. "They didn't deserve you," she said, her voice filled with a protective anger. "They never did. They're not your family, Lydia. They're your kidnappers." And as harsh as it sounded, she was right. They had stolen a life, a history, an identity, and tried to reshape it for their own selfish purposes. In the days that followed, my phone became a war zone. I had blocked Eleanor and Robert, but the messages still came through to my voicemail, a digital graveyard of their desperation. There were furious, rambling messages from my Aunt Carol, accusing me of destroying the family. There were tearful, pleading messages from my father, begging me to reconsider, to think of all the good times. What good times? I wondered. The ones where I was an afterthought. The ones where my successes were ignored. Then came the messages from Eleanor. They weren't pleading. They were cold, manipulative, and laced with venom. "Kevin's numbers are getting worse," one of them said. "He's back in the hospital. I hope you're happy, Lydia. I hope your little search for your real family is worth your brother's life." I listened to them all with a strange sense of detachment, like a scientist observing a specimen under a microscope. Their words had no power over me anymore. Their hooks couldn't find purchase. I deleted them one by one without a reply. A week after the confrontation, I got the call I had actually been waiting for. It was Marcus Thorne, the private investigator. He was a man of few words, with a gravelly voice that suggested a long acquaintance with the world's sorrows. "Got something for you, Miss Sterling," he said. "The adoption was a private one, sealed records. But I pulled some strings, looked into the hospital records from the month you were born. Found a birth certificate with no father listed and a mother who signed away her rights. The details match the non-identifying information the agency gave the Sterlings." My heart leaped into my throat. "Do you have a name?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "I have a name," he confirmed. "Hannah Connolly." She was 17 at the time. "I've also found a possible current address for a Hannah Connolly Robertson in Oregon. About a 3-hour drive from you. Name: Hannah. Location: Oregon." These were the first solid pieces of my own history, the first bricks in a new foundation. It was terrifying and exhilarating all at once. For the first time, my future wasn't about escaping a past defined by others. It was about discovering a past that was truly my own. The next few months were a blur of tentative steps into a new world. After a long, soul-searching conversation with Sarah, I decided to write a letter first. I poured my heart out onto the page, explaining who I was, the circumstances of my discovery, and my hope to connect, without any pressure or expectation. I sent it off with a trembling hand, not knowing if I would ever get a reply. 2 weeks later, an email appeared in my inbox. The subject line was simply, "Lydia." It was from her, Hannah, my birth mother. Her email was full of shock, remorse, and a cautious, overwhelming joy. She told me she had thought about me every single day for 32 years. She was married now, with a 25-year-old son named Ben, my half-brother. She was a landscape designer, a wonderful poetic parallel to my own work as an architect. We create beautiful, lasting things from the earth. Our first video call was awkward and emotional and wonderful. I saw my own eyes looking back at me from her face. I saw my smile on Ben's face. He was a musician, gentle and funny, and he looked at me with a warmth and open curiosity that I had never seen in Kevin. There was no grand, dramatic reunion. There was no fairy tale ending. There was just the quiet, steady, and miraculous work of getting to know one another. Hannah told me her story, one of a scared, unsupported teenager who made an impossible choice, hoping her daughter would have a better life. When I told her how the Sterlings had raised me, what they had intended for me, I saw a flash of fierce maternal anger in her eyes that Eleanor had never once shown me. "They didn't want a daughter," she said, her voice shaking. "They wanted a harvest." It was the most profound validation I had ever received. I learned, through the family grapevine that hadn't quite withered away, what became of the Sterlings. Kevin, after several months on the national transplant list and a few medical emergencies, eventually received a kidney from a deceased donor. He was recovering. The family, however, was not. The story of what Eleanor and Robert had done had fractured their relationships with their siblings and the community. The pastor had reportedly been horrified. They were isolated, left alone with the son they had sacrificed everything for, only to find he was a black hole of need that could never be filled. I felt a distant, detached pity for them, but nothing more. They were the architects of their own desolation. My life, on the other hand, was a construction site, bustling with new activity and bright with promise. I was building a relationship with Hannah and Ben, one brick at a time. I was designing a new wing for a local children's hospital, pouring my renewed sense of purpose into creating a space of healing and light. I was finally building a life on a foundation that was mine, one built not on lies and obligations, but on truth, choice, and a quiet, unshakable sense of my own worth. I didn't need their approval to exist. I didn't need to be a miracle. I just needed to be me. Looking back on it all now, the lesson is so incredibly clear. For years, I thought my value was something that had to be granted to me by others, particularly by the people who raised me. I worked so hard to earn it, to prove it, to be worthy of it, never realizing that it was mine all along. My worth isn't determined by my utility to someone else. It isn't measured by my sacrifices or my ability to meet the demands of others. It exists independently, a solid, unshakable core. The greatest betrayal I suffered wasn't the lie of my adoption. It was being taught that my only purpose was to be a spare part for someone else's life. Breaking free from that wasn't just about leaving a toxic family. It was about reclaiming my own identity as a whole, complete person. What I want to know from all of you is this. Have you ever had to fight to define your own worth against someone else's expectations? Share your story in the comments below because every single one of our stories matters. Don't forget to like this video if my journey resonated with you. And please subscribe to the channel for more stories about finding strength in the truth. Remember, family is not about blood. It's about who shows up, who respects you, and who loves you for who you are, not for what you can do for them. Thank you for listening to my story. I wish all of you the strength to build your own lives on the strongest foundation of all, self-worth.